Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Imagine an empire that spanned 3 continents, whose laws and language shaped the very foundations of Western civilization. An empire of unparalleled military might, architectural marvels, and political intrigue. For over 1,000 years, one name echoed across the known world, a symbol of absolute power and enduring legacy: Rome. But how did a small city-state on the Tiber River rise to command such a vast domain? And what seismic forces led to the spectacular collapse of the greatest empire the world had ever seen? Join us as we journey through the annals of history to witness the epic saga of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Every great power has its creation myth, a story whispered through generations to explain its divine right to rule, its inherent character. For Rome, that story begins not with a philosopher or a king, but with abandoned twins suckling at the teat of a she-wolf. The legend is steeped in divine blood and brutal prophecy, tracing its lineage back to the Trojan hero Aeneas, who fled the ashes of his city to settle in Italy. Generations later, his descendant, King Numitor of Alba Longa, was overthrown by his ambitious younger brother, Amulius. To secure his throne, Amulius forced Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin, sworn to chastity, ensuring no heirs could challenge his rule. But the gods had other plans. Rhea Silvia claimed she was visited by Mars, the god of war, and from this divine union, she bore twin sons, Romulus and Remus. Enraged, Amulius ordered the infants to be cast into the flooding Tiber River. The basket carrying the twins, however, did not sink. It drifted downstream and came to rest at the base of a fig tree, where they were discovered by a she-wolf, the Lupa. The wolf, an animal sacred to Mars, miraculously nursed the boys, protecting them until they were found by a shepherd named Faustulus. He and his wife raised the boys as their own, unaware of their royal blood. Romulus and Remus grew into natural leaders, strong and charismatic, commanding a band of young shepherds. In a twist of fate, a dispute led to Remus's capture and delivery to King Amulius, bringing him face to face with the grandfather he never knew. Faustulus, realizing the truth, revealed their origins to Romulus. Together, the brothers rallied support, stormed the palace, killed the usurper Amulius, and restored their grandfather Numitor to the throne. But they were destined for more than restoring an old kingdom. They were destined to build a new one. They chose a site near the Tiber, where they had been saved, but argued over which hill to build upon. Seeking a sign from the gods, Remus saw 6 vultures from the Aventine Hill, but Romulus, from the Palatine Hill, saw 12. Declared the victor, Romulus began to plow the sacred boundary, the Pomerium, for his new city. In a fatal act of mockery, Remus leaped over the shallow furrow, challenging his brother's authority. In a flash of rage that would define the Roman spirit, Romulus struck his brother down, declaring, "So shall it be for all who dare to leap my walls." On that blood-soaked ground, on the Palatine Hill, the city of Rome was founded, born from divine will, fraternal strife, and a ruthless ambition to build something that would last an eternity. After the mythical reign of Romulus, Rome continued under a line of kings, a period shrouded in a mix of legend and emerging history. The early Latin and Sabine kings established the city's foundational institutions: But it was the arrival of a new, powerful influence from the north that transformed Rome from a cluster of hilltop villages into a true urban center. These were the Etruscans, a sophisticated and wealthy civilization from Etruria, modern-day Tuscany. Their influence culminated in the reigns of Rome's last 3 kings, a dynasty that would forever sour the Roman people on the very idea of monarchy. The first of these Etruscan rulers was Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. An ambitious immigrant, he ingratiated himself with the Roman elite and, through skill and cunning, secured the throne. His reign was marked by military expansion and monumental construction projects. He drained the marshy lowlands between the hills to create the Roman Forum, the heart of public life. He laid out the Circus Maximus for chariot races and, most importantly, began construction of the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer system that was an engineering marvel and essential for the city's growth. He was a builder king, but his ambition set a new standard for royal power. His successor, Servius Tullius, was a figure of reform. He is credited with building the first major defensive wall around the city's 7 hills, and crucially, with conducting the first Roman census. This was not merely a head count, it was a radical reorganization of society. He divided the citizenry into classes based on wealth, tying civic duties and military service directly to property. This Servian constitution, while empowering the wealthy, also created a more organized and formidable state. His reign was seen as just and effective, a stark contrast to what was to come. The final king of Rome was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. His name became synonymous with tyranny. He seized the throne through violence, assassinating his father-in-law, Servius Tullius, and having his body run over by a chariot driven by his own daughter, Tullia. Tarquin ruled with an iron fist, ignoring the Senate and governing through fear. He executed his opponents, seized property, and used forced labor to complete grand projects like the magnificent Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. While he expanded Roman territory and completed impressive works, his arrogance and brutality bred deep resentment among the Roman aristocracy. A silent, simmering rage was building within the city, waiting for a single spark to ignite a revolution that would banish the title of king from Rome for nearly 500 years. Tyranny, by its nature, plants the seeds of its own destruction. For Tarquin the Proud, that seed was sown not on the battlefield or in the Senate house, but in the private chambers of a noble Roman woman. The catalyst for revolution came from an act of profound personal violation that became a rallying cry for public liberty. The story begins at a military camp where the king's son, Sextus Tarquinius, and other young nobles, including Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, were drinking. A debate arose about the virtue of their wives. To settle it, they rode back to Rome unannounced. They found the other wives feasting and socializing, but Collatinus's wife, the noble Lucretia, was at home, dutifully spinning wool with her maids. Her virtue was undeniable, but it ignited a dark desire in Sextus Tarquinius. A few days later, Sextus returned to Collatinus's home alone. He was welcomed as family, but in the dead of night he entered Lucretia's chamber and threatened her with a sword. She was unyielding, unafraid of death. So Sextus resorted to a threat more terrifying than death itself. He told her he would kill her and lay the naked body of a slave beside hers, framing her for the ultimate shame of adultery. To spare her family this unbearable dishonor, Lucretia submitted to his violence, but she would not remain a silent victim. The next day, she summoned her father, her husband Collatinus, and his close friend, Lucius Junius Brutus. Brutus was a nephew of the king who had survived Tarquin's purges by feigning idiocy, his name itself meaning the dullard. In front of these men, Lucretia recounted the horrific assault. She absolved herself of sin, but accepted the punishment. And before they could stop her, she drew a concealed dagger and plunged it into her heart, choosing death over a life lived in shame. In that shocking moment, Brutus was transformed. He pulled the bloody dagger from her chest and, shedding his simpleton disguise, swore a sacred oath over her body. He vowed to pursue Tarquin the Proud and his wicked family with fire and sword, and to never again suffer a king to rule in Rome. His raw, impassioned cry for vengeance electrified the grieving men. They carried Lucretia's body to the Roman Forum, displaying her wound and telling the story of the royal family's crime. The people of Rome, already simmering with resentment, erupted in fury. The rebellion was swift. An assembly was convened, the monarchy was abolished, and the entire Tarquin clan was exiled. In 509 BC, on the ashes of tyranny and the sacrifice of Lucretia, the Roman Republic was born, a new form of government, a res publica, or public affair, where power would no longer rest in the hands of one man. For 2.5 centuries after the founding of the Republic, Rome relentlessly expanded its power, conquering and absorbing its neighbors throughout the Italian peninsula. But its ambition soon brought it into conflict with the other great power of the Western Mediterranean, the maritime empire of Carthage. Located on the coast of modern-day Tunisia, Carthage was a trading powerhouse with a formidable navy that controlled the seas. The inevitable clash between these two rising giants would become a series of 3 brutal conflicts known as the Punic Wars, a struggle for supremacy that would push Rome to the absolute brink of destruction. The First Punic War was primarily a naval contest for control of the island of Sicily. Rome, a land-based power, had to build a navy from scratch. Yet, through brutal persistence and tactical innovation, they defeated the Carthaginians, seizing Sicily and imposing a crippling peace treaty. This humiliation fueled a deep-seated desire for revenge in Carthage, a desire embodied in one man, Hannibal Barca. As a boy, Hannibal was made to swear a sacred oath by his father, a veteran general, to forever be an enemy of Rome. When he came to command Carthage's armies, he prepared to fulfill that oath with a plan of breathtaking audacity. In 218 BC, he launched the Second Punic War. Instead of challenging Rome's new naval dominance, Hannibal decided to bring the war to the heart of Italy by land. He marched his army of tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry, and, most famously, war elephants from Spain, across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and then faced his greatest obstacle, the Alps. His winter crossing of the snow-covered mountains is one of the most legendary feats in military history, a testament to his unbreakable will, though it cost him nearly half his army. Once in Italy, Hannibal proved to be a military genius of the highest order. He inflicted a series of catastrophic defeats on the Romans at the battles of Trebia and Lake Trasimene. But his masterpiece of slaughter came in 216 BC at Cannae. There, with a smaller, more mobile army, he executed a perfect double envelopment, surrounding and annihilating a Roman force of nearly 80,000 men. It was Rome's darkest day. The news sent shockwaves of terror through the city. The cry of "Hannibal ad portas," Hannibal at the gates, became a phrase to frighten children for generations. Rome's allies began to defect, its legions were shattered, and its very survival hung by a thread. The Republic faced its ultimate test against an enemy who seemed invincible. Catherine's ambition was never confined to the gilded halls of St. Petersburg. Her gaze, like that of Peter the Great before her, was fixed southward, towards the warm waters of the Black Sea. This was Russia's Mediterranean, a vital artery of trade and military power, but it was a sea dominated by the Ottoman Empire. For Russia to truly become a global power, this had to change. The pretext for war arrived in 1768, igniting a conflict that would redefine the map of Eastern Europe. Catherine, channeling the spirit of a Roman conqueror, pursued the war with relentless determination. She poured state resources into the military, placing her trust in brilliant commanders like Pyotr Rumyantsev and Alexei Orlov. The Russian war effort was audacious. In a move that stunned the European powers, Orlov led a Baltic fleet on an epic journey around the continent, entering the Mediterranean to attack the Ottomans from their rear. The subsequent Battle of Chesma in 1770 was a catastrophic defeat for the Ottoman navy, effectively annihilating their sea power in the Aegean. On land, Rumyantsev secured a series of decisive victories, pushing ever deeper into Ottoman territory. Yet, this conquest came with severe growing pains. The war was astronomically expensive, stretching the imperial treasury to its breaking point. New taxes were levied upon an already burdened populace, and forced conscription swelled the ranks of the army with resentful peasants. The logistical strain of supplying massive armies across vast distances was immense. Whispers of discontent grew louder across the empire, particularly among the Cossacks, serfs, and ethnic minorities, who felt the sharpest sting of St. Petersburg's demands. While Catherine celebrated her generals' triumphs and the prospect of a Russian flag flying over the Black Sea, the foundations of her empire were beginning to groan under the pressure. The very expansion that was meant to secure her legacy was creating the conditions for the most violent internal challenge she would ever face. The conquest was a success, but the cost was a simmering rage that was about to boil over. While Catherine's armies triumphed abroad, a storm of unprecedented fury was gathering within Russia itself. The seeds of civil war were not sown by disgruntled aristocrats in palace corridors, but by the deep-seated grievances of the common people. The pressures of war, crushing serfdom, and religious persecution had created a powder keg. And in 1773, a Don Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev lit the fuse. He was Russia's Gracchus, a figure who rose from the oppressed to challenge the very structure of the state. Pugachev's genius lay in his audacious claim. He declared himself to be Tsar Peter III, Catherine's murdered husband, miraculously saved from his assassins. This potent myth gave the rebellion a legitimacy it could never otherwise have achieved. To the serfs, old believers, and non-Russian peoples of the Volga region, he was not a rebel, but their rightful sovereign, returned to deliver them from the clutches of a German usurper and the corrupt nobility. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Pugachev issued manifestos that promised freedom from serfdom, an end to taxation, and the extermination of the landowning class. His forces, a motley but massive peasant army, swelled in number, capturing major towns and putting garrisons to the sword. The violence was apocalyptic. Landowners were hunted down and brutally murdered, their estates burned to the ground. For a terrifying period, it seemed as though the entire social order might collapse. Catherine, initially dismissive of the uprising, was forced to confront the gravest crisis of her reign. This was no mere riot. It was a full-scale war, a civil war in all but name that laid bare the deep, festering wounds of her empire. She recalled her finest generals, including Alexander Suvorov, from the Turkish front to crush the insurrection. The state's response, when it was finally organized, was merciless. Pugachev's peasant armies, though brave, were no match for disciplined imperial troops. The rebellion was systematically and brutally extinguished. To build and defend her sprawling empire, Catherine needed more than just a crown and a title. She needed her own versions of Rome's powerful generals, her Marius and Sulla. These were men of immense ambition, talent, and authority. Individuals who could project her will onto the battlefield and into newly conquered lands. Foremost among these titans was Grigory Potemkin. More than a favorite, he was Catherine's co-ruler in all but name. A man of boundless energy and vision, Potemkin was the architect of Russia's southern expansion. As governor-general of the new territories, he wielded near-absolute power, founding cities like Kherson, Sevastopol, and Odessa, and overseeing the creation of the Black Sea Fleet. He commanded armies, conducted diplomacy, and managed the colossal task of integrating Crimea into the empire. His power was so vast that he operated as a virtual sovereign in the south, a warlord whose loyalty was personal to Catherine herself. His famous, and likely exaggerated, Potemkin villages, facades built to impress the Empress on her tour of Crimea, symbolized his flair for grand gestures and his role as the indispensable manager of her imperial project. But Potemkin was not alone. Catherine's reign was defined by a cadre of brilliant military commanders whose victories became legendary. Alexander Suvorov, perhaps the greatest general of his age, was a force of nature who never lost a single battle. His aggressive tactics and rapport with his soldiers made him an idol, a figure of immense personal authority. Pyotr Rumyantsev and Alexei Orlov were others whose successes against the Turks had secured the empire's southern flank. Catherine's genius lay in her ability to manage these powerful, often competing personalities. She empowered them, rewarded them lavishly with titles and estates, but always ensured their ultimate loyalty was to her. She harnessed their ambition for the good of the state, using these formidable warlords to enforce her absolute power without ever allowing them to pose a threat to her throne. The specter that haunted Catherine's Russia was the specter of Spartacus, the ever-present threat of a mass uprising by the millions of serfs who formed the backbone of her empire. These were the slaves of her state, human property bound to the land and to the will of their masters. Catherine had ascended to the throne steeped in the language of the Enlightenment, corresponding with Voltaire and Diderot about liberty and justice. In her early years, she had even convened a legislative commission to reform Russia's laws, hinting at a potential easing of the serf's plight. However, the realities of power soon eclipsed these lofty ideals. The Russian nobility was the pillar of her rule, and their wealth and status were built entirely on the institution of serfdom. To alienate them was to risk her crown. Then came the Pugachev rebellion. This was Russia's servile war, a terrifying explosion of rage from below that confirmed Catherine's worst fears. The rebellion, led by a man promising liberation, demonstrated just how fragile the social order truly was. After its brutal suppression, any thought of enlightened reform for the serfs was abandoned. Catherine's reign, far from alleviating serfdom, saw its codification and intensification. The charter to the nobility in 1785 solidified the landowner's absolute power. Serfs could be bought and sold, separated from their families, beaten and exiled to Siberia, without any legal recourse. They were forbidden from petitioning the empress directly, effectively silencing their voices. While Catherine expanded Russia's borders and dazzled Europe with her court's brilliance, she presided over a system that deepened the misery of the vast majority of her subjects. The defiance of Pugachev, her Russian Spartacus, was crushed, but the underlying injustice remained. By choosing to secure her throne through an alliance with the nobility, Catherine chained the fate of the empire to its most oppressive institution, ensuring that the cry for freedom would echo long after she was gone. By early 1762, the Russian court was a tinderbox awaiting a spark. Emperor Peter III, with his open adoration for Prussia and disdain for Russian customs, had alienated the three pillars of the state: the nobility, the Orthodox Church, and the military. It was in this climate of simmering resentment that a new, informal alliance began to crystallize, a triumvirate of ambition bound by a common goal: the removal of an unpopular emperor. At its heart was the Grand Duchess Catherine, the neglected wife who had spent years cultivating allies and mastering the intricate dance of court politics. She was the mind, the legitimate, albeit tenuous, link to the Romanov dynasty through her son, Paul. She possessed the intellectual rigor and the long-term vision, the Caesar of this burgeoning conspiracy. Her Pompey, the embodiment of military might and popular charisma, was Grigory Orlov, an artillery officer of striking looks and boundless confidence. He and his four brothers held immense sway over the elite guards regiments in St. Petersburg. He was Catherine's passionate champion and lover, providing the muscle and the direct connection to the soldiers who would ultimately decide the fate of the throne. The third corner of this triangle, the Crassus, was more complex, embodied not by one man but by a network of influential figures like Count Nikita Panin. A seasoned diplomat and Paul's tutor, Panin represented the political establishment and the old nobility. He brought cunning, statesmanship, and a veneer of political legitimacy to the plot. While Orlov promised a swift, decisive coup driven by the loyalty of the guards, Panin envisioned a more structured transition, perhaps with Catherine ruling as regent for her son. These three forces, Catherine's intellect, Orlov's military power, and Panin's political influence, were often at odds in their ultimate ambitions. Yet, they were united by the immediate existential threat posed by Peter III. Their secret meetings in the dimly lit salons of St. Petersburg were a delicate balancing act of passion, pragmatism, and raw power, an alliance forged in the shadows to seize control of an empire. The point of no return arrived with shocking swiftness on the night of June 27, 1762. The conspiracy, which had been a whispered secret for months, was suddenly exposed when one of the plotters was arrested. Word was smuggled to Catherine at the Peterhof Palace, miles outside the capital. The message was simple and stark: act now, or all is lost. Her husband Peter was at his nearby estate, Oranienbaum, blissfully unaware. For Catherine, this was her Rubicon. To hesitate meant imprisonment, likely in a convent, and the end of all her ambitions. To act was to risk everything on a desperate gamble for the throne of Russia. She did not hesitate. Before dawn, disguised and accompanied only by Alexei Orlov, she slipped away from Peterhof in an unmarked carriage. The journey to St. Petersburg was a frantic, nerve-wracking race against time. They arrived at the barracks of the Ismailovsky regiment as the sun was rising. Grigory Orlov had done his work well. The soldiers, roused from their sleep, greeted her with thunderous cheers, immediately swearing their allegiance. The die was cast. The rebellion snowballed with incredible speed. Regiment by regiment, the guards declared for Catherine. She donned the uniform of an officer of the Preobrazhensky regiment, a powerful symbol of her commitment, and mounted a white horse to lead her new army. She was no longer a German princess, but a Russian empress in the making, leading her troops to claim their capital. By the time she reached the Kazan Cathedral to be blessed by the clergy, her victory in the city was all but complete. The Senate and the Holy Synod proclaimed her the ruling empress and autocrat of all Russia. In a matter of hours, with astonishingly little bloodshed, Catherine had crossed her river of fate, leaving the Republic of Conspiracy behind for the absolute monarchy she intended to build. The gamble had paid off. While Catherine celebrated her triumph in St. Petersburg, the man who was still technically the Emperor of Russia remained a dangerous loose end. Peter III, upon hearing of the coup, descended into a state of panicked indecision. His half-hearted attempts to rally loyal troops failed spectacularly. Within a day, he was forced into a humiliating abdication, signing away his empire in exchange for a promise of safe passage to his estates in Holstein. Catherine, however, knew that as long as he lived, he was a rallying point for any potential counter-coup. He was not sent to Germany, but instead imprisoned at a nearby estate called Ropshaw, under the watchful eyes of Alexei Orlov and a contingent of guards. This was the final bloody act of the revolution, Russia's own Ides of March. Just over a week after the coup, on July 17, 1762, the world was informed that Peter III had died. The official cause was given as a severe attack of hemorrhoidal colic. Few believed it. The truth, murky and forever debated, was far more brutal. A letter from Alexei Orlov to Catherine, which she may have later tried to destroy, confessed in a panicked scrawl that a drunken brawl had broken out and Peter was dead, though he claimed not to know exactly how it had happened. The most likely scenario is that in a fit of rage and intoxication, Orlov and his men murdered the deposed emperor. Catherine's direct involvement remains unproven, but her complicity is almost certain. She needed him gone. The news was a political disaster, but a strategic necessity. She put on a public display of profound grief, holding a grand funeral for the husband she had overthrown. But behind the scenes, the assassination, this brutal Ides of March, had changed everything. It removed her single greatest threat, cementing her claim to the throne not just by proclamation, but by the grim finality of death. It was a dark stain that would follow her for the rest of her reign. A constant reminder of the bloody price of absolute power. With Peter III dead and the coup successful, the chaotic republic of the conspiracy had served its purpose. Now came the far more difficult task of transforming a usurper into a legitimate sovereign, of establishing a new imperial order from the ashes of the old. This was Catherine's transition from Caesar, the brilliant conspirator, to Augustus, the architect of an empire. Her magnificent coronation in Moscow in September 1762 was the first major step, a masterclass in political theater designed to awe the nobility and legitimize her reign through ancient rites and orthodox splendor. But true power required more than ceremony. It required asserting her authority over the very men who had placed her on the throne. The Orlovs, now showered with titles and wealth, were immensely popular with the army and believed they were the true power behind the crown. Nikita Panin, the statesman, pushed for the creation of an imperial council that would formally advise the empress, a move that would have effectively turned her into a constitutional monarch, limited by the aristocracy. Catherine, however, had not risked everything to share her power. In a move of stunning political acuity, she skillfully navigated these treacherous waters. She listened patiently to Panin's proposal for weeks before deftly rejecting it, declaring that such a council was unsuited to the Russian autocracy. She kept the Orlovs close, rewarding their loyalty with land and titles, but made it clear that their influence extended only as far as she allowed. She began to cultivate a new generation of advisors, men loyal not to the conspiracy, but to her alone. This period marked the true dawn of the Catharinian era. She was no longer merely the beneficiary of a palace coup. She was the autocrat, the undisputed source of all power. She began the immense work of governance, corresponding with Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, reforming laws, and projecting an image of an enlightened despot. The Republic of Plotters was over. The dawn of her empire had begun. While the Roman Empire had its Pax Romana, Catherine the Great engineered her own version, a Pax Catharina, the golden age of the Russian Empire. Ascending to the throne after a tumultuous period rife with palace coups and instability, her long reign represented, for the nobility at least, an unprecedented era of security, prosperity, and cultural blossoming. Catherine understood that power was not merely held by force, but projected through grandeur and intellectual superiority. She positioned herself as the embodiment of the Enlightenment, a philosopher on the throne who corresponded with the great minds of the age, Voltaire and Diderot. This wasn't mere vanity. It was a calculated strategy to rebrand Russia from a remote, semi-barbaric state into a sophisticated European superpower. Her court became a beacon of culture. She founded the Hermitage Museum, beginning with a purchase of 225 paintings from a Berlin merchant, a collection that would grow into one of the world's greatest artistic treasures. She established the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, a pioneering educational institution for women, and championed scientific exploration. The heart of her enlightened project was the Legislative Commission of 1767. She summoned delegates from across the empire to draft a new code of laws based on her nakaz, or instruction, a document heavily influenced by Montesquieu and Beccaria. It spoke of abolishing torture and promoting equality before the law. Though the commission was ultimately disbanded without producing a new code, the sheer ambition of the project sent a powerful message across Europe. For the Russian aristocracy, this was truly a golden age. They were granted greater freedoms from state service. Their power over their serfs was solidified, and they were encouraged to adopt French as the language of polite society, creating a glittering, cosmopolitan elite. This was Catherine's peace, a stable expanding, and culturally vibrant empire, all revolving around the absolute authority of its empress. Just as Rome's stability could shatter into civil war, Catherine's golden age was nearly consumed by a firestorm of rebellion that clawed its way up from the empire's oppressed depths. This descent into chaos had a name: Yemelyan Pugachev. A disgruntled Don Cossack and veteran of Russia's wars, Pugachev possessed a raw charisma and a brazen idea. In 1773, he declared himself to be the miraculously saved Emperor Peter III, Catherine's murdered husband. To the millions of serfs, Cossacks, and ethnic minorities crushed under the weight of the Russian state, this fantastic claim was a spark in a powder keg. What began as a small Cossack uprising rapidly exploded into the largest peasant war in Russian history. Pugachev's rebellion was not a disorganized riot. It was a brutal and terrifyingly effective shadow government. He issued his own decrees, freeing the serfs, abolishing taxes, and promising to hang every landlord and government official. His armies, armed with little more than farm implements and fury, swept across the Volga region, capturing fortresses and major towns like Kazan. The violence was apocalyptic. Nobles were hunted down and slaughtered, their estates burned to the ground. For a terrifying year, it seemed as if the entire imperial structure might collapse. Catherine, who had been busy with wars against the Ottoman Empire and the intellectual games of the Enlightenment, was slow to grasp the existential threat. She initially dismissed Pugachev as a minor brigand, but as his rebellion swelled, she was forced to confront the horrifying reality that her empire rested upon a volcano of human misery. She recalled her best generals, including the formidable Alexander Suvorov, from the Turkish front to mercilessly crush the uprising. Pugachev was eventually betrayed, captured, and brought to Moscow in an iron cage. His public execution was a gruesome spectacle meant to terrorize the populace into submission. The chaos was over, but it left a permanent scar on Catherine's psyche, extinguishing much of her enlightened idealism and replacing it with a hardened, autocratic resolve. Like the great Roman emperors who built monuments to their glory and walls to secure their frontiers, Catherine was an obsessive builder, constructing an empire of both magnificent stone and fortified borders. Her reign fundamentally reshaped the physical and geopolitical map of Russia. In St. Petersburg and its surroundings, she commissioned a breathtaking array of architectural wonders that were intended to rival any capital in Europe. She employed the finest architects of the day, from the Italian Giacomo Quarenghi to the Scotsman Charles Cameron, to realize her neoclassical dreams. The austere marble palace, the elegant Hermitage Theater, and the whimsical Chinese village at Tsarskoye Selo were all monuments to her taste and power. She expanded the Winter Palace and transformed her summer residences into idyllic masterpieces, crafting a landscape that reflected her vision of an ordered, enlightened, and powerful state. Yet her building projects extended far beyond palaces and theaters. Catherine was also building the very structure of her empire, extending its walls to swallow vast new territories. Her most audacious project was the systematic dismantling of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In a series of 3 partitions, conducted with Prussia and Austria, she erased a major European state from existence, absorbing huge swathes of land and millions of new subjects. This act secured Russia's western frontier, eliminating a centuries-old rival. Simultaneously, in the south, Her victories against the Ottoman Empire opened up the fertile steppes along the Black Sea. Under the direction of her favorite, Grigory Potemkin, this new territory, named Novorossiya, was colonized. Entire cities like Kherson, Nikolaev, and the great port of Odessa were founded seemingly overnight, creating a new power base for the empire. Catherine was an empress in the Roman mold, leaving a legacy not just of laws and ideas, but of tangible, enduring structures, cities, palaces, and new, unbreachable borders. Every great empire carries within it the seeds of its own decay, a sickness that festers beneath the glittering surface of its golden age. For Catherine's Russia, this plague was not a foreign contagion, but a native disease woven into the very fabric of society, the institution of serfdom. While Catherine dazzled Europe with her enlightened philosophy and corresponded with Voltaire about liberty and reason, the vast majority of her subjects were sinking deeper into bondage. Her reign, the supposed Golden Age, was a period of profound contradiction, a time when the legal and social chains binding the peasantry were tightened to an unprecedented degree. The Pugachev rebellion had been a violent symptom of this deep-seated illness, but Catherine's diagnosis was fatally flawed. Instead of treating the disease, the desperation of the serfs, she chose to suppress the symptoms with overwhelming force and then reward the nobility, the very class profiting from the system, with even greater power. Throughout her reign, serfdom was not curtailed, but expanded. It was extended into the newly conquered territories of Ukraine, where peasants had once known personal freedom. A 1767 decree forbade serfs from petitioning the empress directly about their masters, effectively silencing their only theoretical path for appeal. Landowners were granted the right to sentence their serfs to hard labor in Siberia, a power previously reserved for the state. This was the great hypocrisy of her rule. The empress who founded schools and collected art presided over a system that treated millions of human beings as property, to be bought, sold, and traded, like livestock. This social sickness had profound consequences. It created a permanent, unbridgeable gulf between the tiny, westernized elite and the vast, impoverished masses. It stunted Russia's economic development and sowed the seeds of future, even more violent, revolutionary upheavals. The glittering palaces and military victories were built upon a foundation of human misery, a moral plague whose effects would haunt Russia for more than a century after its enlightened empress was gone. To understand the mind of an empress who ruled one of the largest empires in history, one must first understand the empires that came before. Catherine the Great was, above all, a student of history and power. She would have looked back at the annals of Rome, not just with admiration for its glory, but with a clinical eye for its fatal weaknesses. The most glaring of these was the crisis of the 3rd century, a harrowing 50-year period where the Roman world nearly tore itself apart. From 235 to 284 AD, the empire was racked by ceaseless civil war, with dozens of so-called barracks emperors rising and falling, often murdered by the very troops who had proclaimed them. The economy collapsed under the weight of hyperinflation, as rulers debased the currency to pay their armies. Plague swept through the population, and the empire's borders, once thought inviolable, were breached by Germanic tribes in the north and the Sasanian Empire in the east. It was a perfect storm of internal decay and external threat. For Catherine, this was not ancient history. It was a living cautionary tale. Her own vast Russian Empire, with its diverse and often resentful populations, was not immune to such a crisis. The Pugachev Rebellion, a massive peasant and Cossack uprising that raged from 1773 to 1775, was her third-century crisis in miniature. It was a terrifying moment that exposed the fragility of her control over the vast hinterlands. Pugachev, claiming to be her murdered husband Peter III, represented the internal rot, the challenge to legitimacy that had plagued Rome. Simultaneously, the ongoing war with the Ottoman Empire was the external pressure on her borders. Catherine understood that, like Rome, her empire could be shattered by the twin forces of internal rebellion and foreign war. Her response to the Pugachev revolt was utterly ruthless, a clear message that internal dissent would be crushed without mercy. She had studied Rome's near collapse and learned its lesson well. An empire on the brink requires not negotiation, but an iron will and the unequivocal display of absolute power to survive. Out of the chaos of the third-century crisis emerged a figure of immense political ingenuity, the Emperor Diocletian. He recognized that the Roman Empire had become too vast, its problems too numerous, for one man to manage alone. His solution was radical and unprecedented: the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. In 293 AD, he divided the empire into an eastern and western half, each ruled by a senior emperor, an Augustus, who was in turn assisted by a junior emperor, a Caesar. It was a brilliant administrative stroke, a system designed to provide localized leadership, ensure a smooth succession, and present multiple fronts against the empire's enemies. The Tetrarchy stabilized Rome for a generation, ending the cycle of assassination and civil war. Catherine the Great, governing an empire that dwarfed even Rome in its territorial expanse, faced a similar administrative nightmare. From the frozen tundra of Siberia to the shores of the Black Sea, Russia was a colossal, unwieldy entity. While she would never countenance sharing her absolute authority as Diocletian had, she understood the core principle of his reform: dividing to conquer the sheer scale of governance. Her answer was not a tetrarchy of rulers, but a comprehensive restructuring of the state itself. The Great Provincial Reform of 1775 was Catherine's version of Diocletian's masterstroke. She broke down the massive, unmanageable old provinces into roughly 50 smaller, more governable gubernias, or governorates. Each was given a standardized administrative, police, and judicial structure, reporting directly to the central government in St. Petersburg. This reform allowed for more effective tax collection, law enforcement, and military recruitment. It was a way to project the power of the throne into the farthest corners of her domain. Where Diocletian divided imperial power among 4 men, Catherine divided administrative responsibility among 50 governors, ensuring that all power ultimately flowed back to one source: herself. She had learned from the Tetrarchy that stability required decentralizing administration while simultaneously centralizing ultimate authority. Following Diocletian's stabilization, another Roman emperor would fundamentally reshape the world: Constantine the Great. His reign was defined by 2 monumental decisions that would echo for a millennium. First, he shifted the center of power eastward, founding a magnificent new capital on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. Named Constantinople, this new Rome was strategically placed at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, easily defensible and perfectly positioned to manage the wealthy eastern provinces and the dangerous Danube frontier. Second, Constantine embraced a new faith, Christianity, ending centuries of persecution and setting the empire on a new spiritual and cultural course. These acts were not merely policy changes. They were a profound rebranding of the Roman identity. For an enlightened despot like Catherine, who was obsessed with legacy and the projection of power, Constantine's story was a masterclass in statecraft. She inherited a new Rome of her own, St. Petersburg. Founded by Peter the Great, it was Catherine who transformed the city into a true imperial capital, a dazzling window on the West that was meant to rival Versailles and Vienna. She poured immense resources into its architecture, art, and culture, making it the undeniable center of Russian power and a symbol of its European ambitions, just as Constantine had done with his city on the Bosphorus. But Catherine also adopted a new faith. It was not a religion, but an ideology, the Enlightenment. She corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, championed reason, and codified laws in her nakaz, or instruction, which was steeped in the language of Montesquieu and Beccaria. This philosophical embrace was her version of Constantine's conversion. It was a tool to legitimize her rule, to present herself as a benevolent, modern, and enlightened monarch, and to culturally reshape the Russian nobility. By championing the Enlightenment, she was attempting to unify her empire under a new set of ideals, creating a new identity for Russia as a sophisticated, powerful European state, just as Constantine had used Christianity to forge a new Roman world. The ultimate lesson Rome offered was one of failure. Despite the reforms of Diocletian and the vision of Constantine, the Western Roman Empire eventually succumbed to what historians have termed the barbarian invasions. For over a century, waves of Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Huns pressed against and eventually broke through the frontiers. The final sacks of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 and the Vandals in 455 were not just military defeats. They were profound psychological shocks that signaled the end of an age. The empire that had once seemed eternal proved to be mortal, its defenses inadequate, its political will fractured, and its strength sapped from within. Catherine the Great was acutely aware of the barbarians at her own gates. To her south lay the formidable Ottoman Empire, a centuries-old rival. To her west was the fractured but still troublesome Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. To her east and south were nomadic tribes and Caucasian Khanate. But Catherine's story is not one of defense and collapse. It is the story of a ruler who reversed the narrative. She did not wait for the invasions. She launched them. She learned from Rome's demise that a passive, defensive posture was a prelude to disaster. Her reign was one of relentless, aggressive expansion. She waged 2 successful wars against the Ottoman Empire, annexing the Crimea in 1783 and securing Russia's warm water access to the Black Sea, a goal of Russian rulers for generations. This was not fending off barbarians. This was conquering them and seizing their lands. In the West, she did not simply repel Polish influence. She orchestrated the partitions of Poland, erasing it from the map of Europe and absorbing vast new territories and populations into her empire. Where Rome had ultimately failed to integrate or defeat the peoples on its borders, Catherine dominated them. The final sack of Rome was a lesson in what happens when an empire loses its nerve, its military superiority, and its expansionist drive. It was a lesson Catherine took to heart. ensuring her Russia would be the expanding power, the conqueror, not the conquered.